Well, hello everyone and welcome to the webinar. Today is August 10th, which is National S'mores Day. So, for this presentation, go grab some marshmallows, chocolate, graham crackers, and enjoy the webinar today. I am delighted to be able to speak with all of you today. At Kroll, we are always looking to provide thoughtful insight and great value to our clients to help them defend their organization against the latest cyber threats and improve their cyber maturity. My name is Keith Wojciech. I am the Managing Director and Global Head of Threat Intelligence for Kroll Cyber and based in Washington, D.C. I've been with Kroll for about 5 years now, and prior to this, I worked for the U.S. Secret Service, where I was able to have the opportunity to lead the Secret Service's Cyber Threat Intelligence Program. Before we get started, I want to cover a few housekeeping items. Today's session will be recorded and will be available after the briefing. We're using GoToWebinar for the presentation, and you'll find the client on your monitor. Through that client, you'll be able to submit questions at any time, and our presenters will address questions at the end. Today, we'll be looking at the current trends that our threat intelligence team has been seeing in 2022. Kroll, it really is in a unique position to deliver end-to-end cybersecurity solutions across several different service lines. Kroll Cyber carried out over 3,200 incident response engagements in 2021. We're going to hear more about what we've seen in the second quarter of 2022. We do have a wealth of experience with over 550 cybersecurity experts on the Kroll team who are working around the globe with companies of many sizes, varieties of industries, and we work with over 60 cyber insurance carriers. This really gives us a tremendous visibility into what's going on the front lines. Today, we'll be taking a look at the current trends that our threat intelligence team has been seeing in quarter 2 of 2022. In this session, we're going to cover how we've seen over a 90% increase in attacks against healthcare sector due to the rise of ransomware. Now, back a few years, maybe a year ago, they have always said, hey, I will leave the healthcare sectors alone. The promise from the cyber criminals really is kind of out the window at this point. We want to be able to discuss the impressive increase of about 700% Kroll has seen in initial access utilizing remote services. Though Donald Duck may be a favorite, the uptick in use of crackbot malware has led to many ransomware attacks for new threat actor groups such as Blockbuster. Lori and George will take you through a couple of case studies to really show you the reality of these attacks. We are very fortunate, and I'm really excited to have two leading Kroll experts join us today. We're joined by Lori Iacono and George Glass. Lori is an Associate Managing Director in Kroll Cyber Risk. Lori manages the day-to-day operations for the Cyber Threat Intelligence Program, which has many functions throughout Kroll to include supporting incident response engagements. Prior to this, Lori managed the Brand and Consumer Protection Program at the National Cyber Forensics Training Alliance, or known as the NCFTA, headquartered in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. George Glass is the head of applied intelligence at Kroll and is responsible for ensuring that the latest threat actor intelligence is applied to our proprietary XDR platform used to power our managed detection and response service to clients around the globe. Now try to say that 10 times fast. Before joining Kroll, George had a background working across the defense, finance, and e-commerce sectors in the UK. With that, I'm going to turn over to Lori that gives us more insight into the threat landscape of 2022. Lori?
Thanks, Keith. So thank you for that introduction, and thank you everyone for joining this afternoon or this morning, depending on where you're at. So what we're going to go over today are our findings from Q2 of 2022. And before we go into this, for those of you who may be new to our sessions, I want to give a little background of our methodology. So what we are looking at today is primarily data from our incident response cases. So these are cases where clients or victim organizations engaged with Kroll to conduct incident response investigations in the wake of some kind of cyber incident or attack. So as I said, a lot of our data will be coming from these incident response cases. So we're looking at live data and we'll go into some real case studies of things happening in the wild. What we do is also, as we work in threat intelligence at Kroll, we're always looking across, what we're seeing, not just incident response. We're also combining that with what we're seeing from the managed detection and response side of the house, which is what George will represent today. And then we also are, collating that with what we're seeing across open source intel reporting, as well as what we're seeing activity that we see in the dark web, where various cyber criminals are offering services or maybe bragging about their services on various forums. So to get us started this morning, I want to start here with looking at the top sectors that we saw being targeted in the second quarter. As Keith mentioned, healthcare, we saw a lot of dramatic increase in targeting against the healthcare sector in our quarterly cases. Rounding out that top 5 were professional services, financial services, technology and telecom, as well as manufacturing. This next column here is looking specifically at ransomware variants. And the ones we saw being the most active in the second quarter were Conti, Black Basta, Black Cat, and Quantum Locker. And then we were also going to talk today a lot about initial access, and this is probably one of the most common questions we get, is how are threat actors getting into systems? Because, you know, if we know how they're getting in, then hopefully we can put some controls into place to keep them out. And what we were seeing a lot of in the second quarter were actors coming in via vulnerable external remote services. So things like Open Remote Desktop Protocol, or RDP, or legacy vulnerabilities or unpatched vulnerabilities to VPN appliances. We were also seeing, again, as we've seen in previous quarters, a lot of CVE and zero-day exploitation, particularly with some high-profile ones like Log4j and Proxy Shell. And phishing continues to be, it's the tried and true tactic of many cyber criminals. That's an easy way for them to get into systems, unfortunately. So if we go on to the next slide, I'm actually going to start. Our first case study starts with a phishing email, as many cyber attacks do. So this was an interesting case. This was a healthcare organization that was hit by ransomware. And as I said, it started off with a phishing email. There were a couple of things that were interesting about this phishing email. First of all, it came from an external sender. It came from a known external sender. So their systems had probably been hijacked in some kind of way, and they were replying to old legacy threads. Well, this particular thread, the victim had asked for a document from this user, and the threat actor replied to the email with a link. When they did that, on the client side, things worked correctly. The email filter actually identified that email and quarantined it to their spam folder. But our user here looked at the spam folder, knew that that was a trusted contact they had, and actually approved that message to go into their inbox. And once that was approved, that user then clicked on a link, which led them to download a malicious zip file. That zip file then infected their systems with Quackbot or Qbot, and once that infection was on the network, this led to the deployment of Cobalt Strike. While the actors were on the network here via Cobalt Strike, they did a lot of data exfiltration. And we're going to talk about that a lot today, this tactic we call double extortion. And this is a tactic that many threat groups are using right now, where as part of their attack, they're exfiltrating data. Then later, they're using that exfiltrated or stolen data as kind of leverage to pressure victims into paying some kind of a ransom. So it's not just give us, $1 million and we'll decrypt your network. It's give us $1 million and we won't publish this confidential data that we stole from you. Unfortunately, this is effective for many cybercriminal groups, especially for a sector like healthcare, where you're seeing they have access to a lot of confidential data, personally identifiable information, PII, as well as protected health information that they want to keep secure. So in this case, after the actors came in and stole this data, they ended up deploying on the system Black Basta ransomware. So this was kind of a full circle, as you can see, of one of our cases, starting with that phishing email, leading to a malicious download, a Qbot infection, data being stolen, large quantities of data being stolen, and then a network encryption. And I will say too, I call it Black Basta. I noticed last week, I think George calls it Black Basta, so I feel like Black Basta, it might be the tomato of cyber right now. But we can go into the next slide, and I want to talk a little bit more specifically about what we're seeing with ransomware. So if we move on to the next slide here, we have a chart looking at the threat incident types that we were seeing in Q2. Can we move the slide? Thank you. So for threat incident types, the most popular threat incident type we were seeing in the second quarter of this year was ransomware at about 33%, or a third of all of our cases. Now, as you can see here, we're always looking, our quarterly reports are always looking kind of quarter over quarter to see any changes to help us identify trends within the quarters. And it's really just a snapshot of what we're seeing every quarter, right? So we are seeing from the end of 2021, we do see ransomware is not quite as prevalent as we were seeing it at the end of 2021, but we are still seeing a lot of ransomware activity, and we have seen in the recent months that ransomware activity is on an incline. Email compromise continues to be a prominent threat incident type that we see. A lot of that is what we would call business email compromise. And then we have this other category here, unauthorized access, that we are seeing a little more of. This particular category, this includes a couple different things that we classify here, such as insider threat. So employees who may have access to information that they shouldn't, or may have stolen a laptop or been terminated and their accounts weren't properly disabled, that would fall into this unauthorized access section, as well as an actor maybe getting into a network but being stopped before something more malicious could happen, like a BEC attempt or a ransomware deployment. And then finally, kind of rounding out those threat incident types, we see web compromise also on the list. So going in to the next slide here, we'll look specifically at the variants. So what's some of the activity that we're seeing from these ransomware groups in the second quarter? So one of the big stories in the second quarter this year was a lot of drama surrounding the Conti ransomware gang. This group has been active, I want to say, for about at least the last 18 months. They've been one of the most active ransomware gangs that we've been seeing. And you can see in Q2 of this year, there was a pretty big drop from their 2021 highs, where they went from about 35%, accounting for 35% of cases at the end of 2021, only about 18% of cases in the second quarter here. So a lot of reasons for this decline. This group had suffered a lot of high-profile leaks, especially in the first half of this year. There was also a lot of law enforcement and international attention on this group. Here in the United States, the Department of State had actually issued a bounty for anyone who had information related to the individuals associated with Conti ransomware. So there was, like I said, a lot of attention on this group, which ultimately led to their shutdown. So that ransomware site, their extortion site where they were posting victim information, their chat negotiation site where they were negotiating with victims, all of that went dark on June 23rd, so almost at the end of the second quarter, but we had seen this decline in activity prior to that. On the other hand, Black Bossa was a group that we were seeing definitely on the rise. And one of the keynotes of what Black Bossa was doing was leveraging Qbot malware for access. A couple other groups that we saw on the rise were Black Cat, Quantum Locker, and Hive. Hive specifically was really aggressively focusing on healthcare. There were a couple of public advisories in the United States from the Department of Health and Human Services, specifically talking about Hive ransomware, focusing on the healthcare sector. If we go on to the next slide here, I do want to talk about a case study involving ransomware. So this particular study, I will say this was a very extreme example of a ransomware, but it started out with a client came to us. They had a ransomware encryption. This is pretty standard, something we see very commonly. But once we started doing forensics for that victim, we found that there wasn't just one ransomware encryption in their network, but they had actually been hit by at least 3 different groups on various parts of their servers. So the question is, how does this happen, right? How can one client or one victim be hit by 3 different ransomware groups? And the answer I would say to that is, first of all, we know ransomware groups to be very opportunistic. They are looking for the easiest way to get in. They're looking for an open door, right? Unfortunately, in this case, the victim organization had a legacy vulnerability to their VPN appliance. So they were unpatched for a 2018 Fortinet vulnerability. And this particular vulnerability is one that we know from, looking in the dark web. We know that ransomware actors are definitely scanning for this vulnerability. One of the reasons for that is because this vulnerability basically allows an attacker to run an exploit to pull down plain text usernames and passwords for anyone who was logging into that VPN session. So this allows them to get those usernames and passwords. Now, if they come back to the system and the system does not have some kind of multi-factor authentication in place, this makes it unfortunately very easy for them to pivot into the system. So as I said, this is a rather extreme event, having 3 ransomware groups on one victim, but it does kind of highlight the problems we have with unpatched networks and how ransomware groups are targeting those. So moving on to the next slide here, I do want to touch on, we mentioned before that Black Basta group is leveraging Qbot or Quackbot for their delivery. And I'm going to have George talk a little bit about what we're seeing in relation to those Qbot or botnet infection chains.
Thank you very much, Laurie. Yep, the first half of this year was a very interesting one for malware analysts out there. We're seeing a lot of heightened activity around Quackbot and a number of other loader-style malware or initial access malware. We're seeing rapid development and rapid deployment of changes to the infection flow. And this is really due to the fact that Microsoft have changed their policies on how Microsoft Office will handle inbound files that have the mark of the web, i.e. they have a piece of metadata on them that says they are downloaded from outside the organization, how those files will handle macros. So the last few years have mostly been made up of Excel 4.0 macros or VBA macros embedded into Excel or Word documents. But because of these changes that Microsoft are making, that's really no longer a viable attack methodology for these initial access malware strains. So what you're seeing in front of you here is the entire attack chain for this particular Quackbot infection. This is a slightly newer version than what we're seeing in Q2, but I think this is a really good example and very indicative of all of the sort of tactics that we're seeing employed by not only Quackbot. We've recently released a blog post on Bumblebee malware. We're seeing this on IceID and Emotet as well, all of which should be considered a precursor to ransomware event. As you can see on this chain, it begins with HTML smuggling, and again, this is something that we're seeing with other malware strains such as Mass and Bookus, which means that all of the tools that are required to infect the victim are smuggled in as a HTML page attached to an email, either a reply chain or just a cold calling spam campaign. This particular campaign presented the user with a fake Adobe web page, which downloads a zip. Now, that's downloaded in inverted commas because that zip isn't being downloaded from anywhere. It's base64 encoded inside the HTML document, but nevertheless, a browser window will interpret that as a download. That zip then itself contains a .iso container, which contains an LNK, That LNK then uses a very interesting side-loading attack. So as you can see here, calc.exe is bundled in that initial HTML payload as well. That's a legitimate file from Windows, but a malicious DLL file that calc loads when it's opened is also bundled in there, which decrypts an encrypted Quackbot payload and installs it using regserve32, schedules tasks, and then use PowerShell to install and maintain Quackbot persistence. So if we move to the next slide, I'll just go through some of the pieces of social engineering that this particular malware uses. As you can see here, this is the fake download page which is being used here. Again, it's a password encrypted zip, and all of the steps along this chain are deliberately designed to bypass antivirus and endpoint detection and response tools. We're seeing rapid changes in the way that these are deployed, but they all use a similar method of firstly bypassing the mark of the web. That can be as simple as including a encrypted zip folder, but as we can see in this particular case, it's using ISO and LNKs as well in order to achieve those objectives. If we go to the next slide, this is what the user will see when they get to the very end of the attack chain. This is a sandbox version, so it looks pretty old school, but the highlighted file that you can see there is the LNK. This is the last piece of user interaction that the user needs to do, and double clicking that essentially infects the user with the Quackbot malware. It also opens calculator, so maybe there's a way of detecting something slightly off there, but nevertheless, this is the sort of the general trend that we're seeing in all of these malware families. A number of steps that the user has to undergo in order to infect an endpoint, but all of them designed specifically to defeat either inline security tooling, antivirus, or endpoint detection and response tools. So if we go back and summarize this attack chain in, as a final stop here, we can see that there are not only HTML smuggling techniques being used here, but there's a very long and complicated attack chain, which provides us with a really good way of sort of understanding how these malwares are moving, what directions that other malware strains may take in order to defeat endpoint detection response tools, but also provide a really good understanding of areas that we can work on for detecting these particular pieces of malware.
Yeah, so George, this like really strikes me because I know at the beginning I talked a little bit about, you know, the email catching the malicious email and then it going in spam filter and the user still approved it. So I guess, you know, looking at this long attack chain, there's so many points for user interaction. What suggestions do you have for either deterring users from proceeding with this or stopping them altogether?
That's a really good point that you make. It's something that is sort of a particular bugbear of mine is that in so many cases the user is the last line of defense for a lot of organizations, but as security professionals, if that really truly is the last line of defense in a lot of these cases, we're probably not doing our job very well. If we put ourselves in the shoes of the user in this case, they're just trying to do their job, right? They're just trying to answer the email and respond to that. Maybe it's an invoice that it's you know, masquerading as, or what have you. We need to be able to detect and respond, but also provide mitigating steps so that the user may not even be able to open these particular files. Sorry, excuse me. ISO and LNK files, for example, there's really no need for the majority of users to really need to open these particular types of files. ISO containers especially, these could be blocked in group policy. So ideally, there would be groups set up for users that do need to use these files, probably some sort of administrator or IT team. But for the rest of the organization, they can be simply blocked from being opened. And again, that would kill this attack chain immediately. If you can't bypass if you can't open that ISO container, you can't click the LNK. So that's a really good step. Secondly, in this particular example, and there are many more like it, we are presented here with a huge amount of detection opportunities at the end of the attack chain. Now, we need the threat intelligence information to know that this is the attack chain and ways of detecting and responding to it. But this is a particularly noisy way of attacking an organization, especially popping calc. All of those sorts of things can lead to really tight detections. So even if the user does go through all those steps, they do manage to open the ISO, click the LNK, and Quackbot begins its installation process, we can detect and respond to that, isolate the endpoint, and move into recovery mode. So those are some really good steps to take. And the final thing is that's the user, right? We can educate the user better on how these new malware, like initial access malwares, are using social engineering to trick users into opening things. So, for example, that fake web page. There's a really good gotcha on that one. If we go to the next slide, please, I think we've got a screenshot of it. Yeah, here it is. That's a local file, right? That's not going to the web. That's a local file indicative of the C:/users. This is a dead giveaway that something isn't quite right about this particular file. Now, there are some websites and services that do choose this method for interacting with applications, but I think they're so few and far between, and if users are not expecting to have these types of files, this is something that they should be trained to immediately raise to a security champion or representative in their organization. And that's the easiest way to stop this thing from happening, is users trained to identify something like this being fishy, and needs to be raised to the security team. I think that's it from me on this one. Back over to you, Laurie. Cheers.
Thanks, George. Yeah, and I think if anything, it highlights the importance of having that multi-layered security approach, because user education is really important. But at the end of the day, users trying to do, like as you said, they're trying to do their job, right? So if they're not security professionals like us, these things may not be as suspicious. So there has to be some kind of education there, but also some kind of tooling or other technical security controls in place, so that if they do proceed with that, it won't spread to the rest of the network, hopefully. It's a good point there, George. Thank you. So next, we're going to go into looking specifically at what we were seeing within the healthcare sector. So if we go over here, we'll look at we see about a 90% increase from Q1 to Q2 as in relation to targeting of the healthcare sector. So we had about 21% of our cases in Q2 were related to healthcare, making it the top targeted sector. And professional services had been pretty much the top targeted sector that we were seeing for the last couple of quarters. So looking specifically at our healthcare cases, what were some of the things that we were seeing? First of all, the top threat incident type impacting healthcare that we observed was ransomware, followed by unauthorized access and email compromise. A lot of those unauthorized access cases there for healthcare were related to insider threat. So again, highlighting that end user management that organizations face. It's not just about clicking emails, but we also need to pay attention to having some kind of insider threat security program. Looking at initial access methods for healthcare, phishing was the most common initial access for all threat incident types, but if we look just at ransomware in healthcare, we could see that external remote services was a very common way for actors to get in. Another thing we looked at for healthcare was there just one group that was targeting them? So looking at the ransomware cases, we didn't necessarily see that it was just one group. I know Hive had been publicized as the group that was maybe targeting them the most. We saw multiple different groups targeting healthcare, from Karakurt to Conti to Black Basta as well. So if we go on over here to the next slide, we're going to start talking about initial access specifically. So looking here, we can see, one of the kind of, big points of our session today was this rise that we saw in external remote services being leveraged by threat actors. And I have to say, external remote services, it's something that we definitely see all the time, actors using this, particularly ransomware groups. So it's not necessarily a new trend or a new threat. We just happen, in our cases, we saw more of it in the second quarter. Phishing, though, remained the top initial access method. Looking at some of our cases where external remote services was used for access, some of the kind of trends, I guess you could say, that we saw with those cases were a lot of them were instances where multi-factor authentication was not applied to these remote services. And we know historically a lot of ransomware groups use what they call initial access brokers to get into systems. So they'll actually buy verified usernames and passwords for organizations on the dark web. If they go then to find an open RDP and there's no MFA on it, it makes it pretty easy. It makes their job pretty easy to get into the network. Another thing that we were seeing there were, as the case study earlier showed, we saw some instances where they were unpatched for legacy vulnerabilities like the Fortinet CVE. And we also saw some instances where maybe companies had migrated. They had an old, less secure remote access system. Maybe because of the pandemic and work from home, they have migrated to a newer, more secure system. But the problem was they hadn't completely disabled or terminated that old system. So threat actors were still able to get in via that legacy route. We also were seeing a CVE and SQL injection being used for initial access. And I'm going to pause here and kind of ask George what you were seeing from the MDR side as related to those two initial access methods.
Yeah, we've definitely observed some really nasty CVEs in the last quarter, specifically around Confluence and VMware products as well. In regards to SQL injection, what we're seeing is some in-house built applications being exploited. And we often talk quite a lot about endpoint detection response and vulnerabilities and patching and that sort of thing, but not quite so often as about web app security. So this is a really good place to remind everyone that web application security and then proper security processes when developing applications is just as important as the security tooling that you place on your devices as well. So yeah, I think that's a good place to remind people of that.
Yeah, that is a good reminder. So if we go on to the next slide here, we're going to talk a little bit more about an example of, or this one is actually looking at specifically ransomware initial access methods. And you can see here when we drill down into just ransomware cases and those initial access methods, we really saw the external remote services accounted for a very large majority of those cases. So as I said, this is something that we definitely know the ransomware groups are leveraging this for initial access. We also see ransomware groups leveraging CVE or zero-day exploitation. We're going to talk about a case study of that next. And then we continue to see them using phishing, not to the degree that they're using things like VPN or RDP, but groups like Black Basta using Qbot, they're leveraging phishing, a tried and true technique to get into systems. So finally, let's go over to our last, I think this is our last case study here. But this is one that started with the Log4Shell vulnerability and led to Black Hat ransomware. So in this particular one, our victim came to us. Their network had been encrypted with Black Hat ransomware. What we were able to identify through our investigation was that the actors had come in through the Log4j exploit. One thing that we identified was, very shortly prior to them coming in on this exploit, we identified that there had been some vulnerability scanning on their system. So essentially, as we talked about earlier, these threat actors are looking for vulnerable systems. So they had done the scanning, they had identified that the system had a certain appliance that they knew was vulnerable to log4j. Once they knew that, it didn't take them long to exploit that and get into the system. Once they were in, via that exploit, they maintained, or they basically launched multiple different tools to help them maintain persistence, as well as using a tool we call Mimikatz to collect credentials. And this actually helped them access over I think it was over 800 some endpoints that they were able to access while they were in the network, which allowed them to exfiltrate hundreds and hundreds of gigabytes of data during this time. And after they had gotten all the data that they wanted so that they could pressure the victim into paying, they encrypted the network with Black Hat ransomware. So as I said, just another case study where they were using high profile, but now we're getting into where it's like a 6 or 7 month old vulnerability. So if we go on to our next slide here, we're going to go into the summary of what we were seeing in Q2. And as we discussed, the trending initial access method was really external remote services. Most common threat incident types that we were seeing were ransomware and email. And as that last case study showed, we continue to see ransomware groups leveraging publicized vulnerabilities that organizations have still not patched for. And then George, do you want to speak a little bit about what we're seeing with those changing infection chains?
Yes, as mentioned, we're seeing very rapid redeployment of many different strains of malware in response to Microsoft's mark of the web policy. I think we're going to continue to see this over the next few months. What's particularly striking is the depth of the attack chain and the rapid development cycle that they're undertaking. Typically, we would usually see sort of changes maybe once or twice a month, and in some cases over Q2, we saw changes daily to infection chains. So it's very important to keep up to date with those changes that are being made and test them against antivirus and EDR tooling to ensure that you can detect and respond to those threats effectively.
Thanks, George. And finally, we never want to leave everyone like, we know this is like a scared straight kind of cyber presentation that we have, but we always want to leave you with some actions that organizations can take. Because kind of, as I said at the beginning, the reason we highlight all this information is because it's really like a good reminder of all the different ways that threat actors are using to get into systems. And hopefully, if you're watching the quarterly sessions on a regular basis, it kind of covers a lot of different things. And if you take some of that advice into your own organization, hopefully that can help you prevent being one of the case studies that we talk about, right? So when it comes to external remote services, what can we do to keep actors out? One of the biggest things we're recommending is, review or audit your systems and your organization that are using remote services. As I said earlier, some of the ways that we were seeing them getting in was via legacy systems. So if conducting some kind of review of your systems that are using that can hopefully avoid that. Making sure that unused RDP ports are closed or disabled. Here I mentioned enforced account lockouts. So this would be protective in the event that an attacker was doing a password spraying or a credential stuffing attack against one of your RDPs or VPNs. They're trying to guess a lot of usernames and passwords in a short amount of time to see if they can get in. If you can identify if they're trying a password over and over on a domain admin account or something like that, if maybe there's a threshold for locking that account after so many attempts, that can potentially keep attackers out and maybe flag you that something suspicious is happening. Again, on the side of flagging you if something suspicious is happening, we do recommend logging RDP login attempts, not only so that you can possibly detect if something suspicious is happening. But also I know from our side, our investigators always like very robust logging records to help with their investigations. Also, probably one of the most important things you can do for your remote services is enabling multi-factor authentication, either a one-time passcode or some kind of number matching that needs to be done to access the system remotely. Implementing strong password rules. So a lot of actors, have basically told us, or we've identified once they're in the network, that an easy way for them to pivot once they're inside the network is by guessing passwords. And the reason that sometimes they're able to guess those passwords is because the passwords are weak. So think of things like summer 2022. That would definitely go into the bad password hall of fame, right? So making sure that you have complexity rules and you are enforcing them in your organization. Also, regularly patching for, testing, and scanning for vulnerabilities. As we talked about earlier, we know the threat actors are scanning for those vulnerabilities. So if we can do that proactively as organizations, hopefully we can identify that before a threat actor does. And particularly for vulnerabilities in things like RDP and VPN services, which we know threat actors tend to target. And then George, do you want to talk about the last section, more on the EDR side?
Sure, thanks, Laurie. Yeah, as we've been discussing earlier, deploying EDR sensors to as many endpoints as possible is certainly one of the best ways to detect these sorts of attacks as early as possible. Specifically in regards to malware, it's incredibly effective as long as you have the right rule sets and block lists and allow lists in place. Blocking policies for ISO and LNK files. This goes for any number of other files as well that users may not need to use, .ps1 files and what have you. This is just sort of general cyber hygiene and sort of account limiting activities that you can do to try and stay in step or even ahead of some of the tactics that are being used by initial access brokers and malware authors. And finally, as we mentioned earlier, taking all the knowledge that hopefully you've got from today and educating users about the way that threat actors are moving to use novel infection chains and infection vectors so they can spot and raise those spurious emails that they're getting to security personnel as quickly as possible as a really good way to stop the threat before it even enters an endpoint.
Awesome. Thank you very much, George. Lloyd, really do appreciate it. So sadly, we run out of time for today. Really a big thank you for everyone that's taking time out to tune in, and we hope you really enjoyed the session today. We do have one question that came in, and just want to kind of review it real quick. So I'm gonna push it out there to Lori and George. For external remote access attacks that you've seen, would any of these have been prevented by utilizing MFA? So either George or Lori, can you address that?
Yeah, I can take that. Yeah, so a lot of the attacks that we saw could have been prevented if some kind of multi-factor authentication would have been used. As I said earlier, a couple of the ones we saw, there were maybe some brute force or credential stuffing against the appliances. Sometimes they were getting out with what we call valid accounts. So likely maybe they had purchased a username and password for that organization off of some dark web market, and they were using that to get in, and without some kind of MFA, they were able to do that fairly easily, unfortunately.
Awesome. Thank you, Lori. Really do appreciate it. Like I said, we ran out of time for today. Really do appreciate everyone being on. So we have published our Q2 2022 threat landscape report on the Kroll website. So if you want to go into more details about the trends we've outlined today, then please have a read of the report. You can also find a copy of it in the handout section in the GoToWebinar platform. When you're leaving the briefing, you'll be directed to a short survey. If you could spare a few moments, we greatly appreciate if you could tell us your thoughts on the session. It really helps us prepare for future sessions as well. Once again, thanks again for joining today. Enjoy the rest of your day, and we hope to see you at one of the future briefings. Take care.
Thank you.
Thanks.